This is my true story. After my wife passed away, I devoted my life to my daughter. She was my pride, my reason to live. I thought she would care for me when I grew old, but I was wrong. The girl I raised became someone I barely recognized. One night, her words killed every bit of faith I had left. What happened next changed everything. Before I tell you what I did, tell me where you're watching from, what time it is there, and make sure to subscribe. Because sometimes, revenge doesn't scream. It signs documents quietly. For most of my life, everything I did was for my daughter. I worked long hours in factories and small shops, taking shifts others refused. My body ached more with every year, but her smile kept me moving. I skipped meals to pay her tuition, borrowed against my pension for her wedding, and sold the land my father left me so she could buy her dream house. I told myself it was worth it. She was my only child, my greatest reason to live. I never cared much for comfort. I wore the same old coat for 15 years, drove a car that barely started, and never went on holidays. Every extra dollar I earned went straight to her account. When she traveled abroad for university, I slept in an empty house and smiled through the loneliness, believing I was doing what any good father would. I didn't mind the silence, as long as she was happy. But somewhere along the way, her happiness turned into distance. Calls came less often, visits stopped altogether. When she did come home, it was with new clothes, new friends, and an attitude I couldn't recognize. She looked at me differently, not with warmth, but with mild irritation. I told myself it was youth, a busy life, stress. Still, each word from her felt sharper, shorter, colder. When her mother died, I thought that loss would bring us closer. Instead, she drifted further. I tried small things, cooking her favorite meals when she visited, sending her handwritten letters, even wiring money when she didn't ask for it. But gratitude never came back. The silence between us grew heavy, like a door slowly closing. Even then, I didn't stop loving her. A parent doesn't. Love doesn't end when respect fades. It just hurts differently. I kept telling myself she would realize one day that all the sacrifices I made weren't debts to repay, but signs of love. I thought if I stayed patient, she would see that I had given her my entire life so hers could be easier. I couldn't see the storm coming. I couldn't imagine that the same daughter I carried in my arms would one day speak to me like a stranger. That one sentence, the one that would erase decades of effort, was still waiting in her throat, waiting for the moment she'd let it fall. The first signs of her change were small, so small that I almost ignored them. At first, she stopped calling every weekend. She'd send quick messages instead, short replies that felt more like obligations than affection. "Busy, Dad. Can't talk now. Maybe next week." I told myself it was normal. She had her own life, her own world. But when months passed without a single visit, I started realizing that distance doesn't only happen in miles, it happens in the heart first. When she finally did visit, she seemed different. The way she spoke, the way she looked at me, it was like she had outgrown the idea of having a father. She spent most of her time on her phone, half listening while I talked. I'd ask about work, and she'd reply with a sigh. I'd ask if she needed anything, and she'd say, "I'm fine." But it wasn't fine. There was a tone in her voice, one that said she didn't see me as a man anymore, just as a responsibility. She started correcting me in front of people. When guests came over, she'd roll her eyes if I forgot something or spoke too slowly. I could see embarrassment flicker in her face whenever I mentioned her childhood stories, as if remembering she once needed me was an inconvenience. I laughed along to hide the sting, but inside, I felt the wall building. It wasn't made of anger, it was made of shame. She was ashamed of me. Then came the excuses. "You don't understand how things work now, Dad. You're too old-fashioned. Stop worrying about things that don't matter." Each time she said it, she chipped away at the respect that once held our family together. I had built everything with my hands, our house, her education, her comfort. But now, all that effort had turned invisible. I wasn't a hero in her story anymore. I was background noise. At one dinner, she had friends over. Smart, loud, young people who talked about investments and business trips. I sat quietly, listening, trying to keep up. She laughed when I misheard something, and her friends joined in. For the first time, I felt like a stranger in my own home. My daughter, the one who once held my hand crossing the street, now laughed at me across the table. I excused myself early that night, pretending to be tired. But I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch, staring into the dark, wondering what I'd done wrong. Days turned into weeks, and the coldness continued. She stopped saying "I love you" when ending calls. Birthdays became messages instead of visits. When I tried to remind her of simple things, to call her aunt, to check on her mother's grave, she would snap, "You worry too much. Live your life." But what she didn't see was that she was my life. There was nothing else left. I began to notice she had changed more than emotionally, financially too. She had grown ambitious, almost greedy. Every talk somehow turned into money. "Dad, you should transfer the house to my name," she once said casually. "It's just safer for you." I smiled and nodded, pretending to think about it. But inside, I knew what was happening. The love had turned transactional. She didn't visit me because she cared. She visited when she needed something signed. The first crack in her voice came during one of those moments. She spoke with impatience, like she was managing an employee, not speaking to her father. It wasn't cruelty at first. It was convenience. Respect takes effort, and she had none left to give. I could feel her waiting for me to fade away so she could move on with her perfect life. But the real break, the one that split my heart, was yet to come. I didn't know that one careless sentence, spoken over dinner, would end everything I believed in. One sentence that would turn a lifetime of giving into a single moment of silence. That night started like any other. I had cooked a simple meal, rice, soup, and her favorite roast, hoping she might stay for dinner. She arrived late, already distracted, scrolling through her phone between bites. Her tone was short, her words clipped, and every sigh sounded heavier than the last. I tried to ignore it, tried to keep the peace, but something inside me knew the moment was coming, the one that would change everything between us. It began when I asked her to slow down, to spend more time together. She looked up, irritated, and said she was too busy with work, meetings, and people who actually mattered. That stung, but I stayed quiet. I reminded her softly that she hadn't visited in months, and she laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. "You really have nothing better to do you?" she said, still scrolling. I wanted to remind her that she was the reason I'd built everything, the reason I'd kept living after her mother died. But before I could, she put her phone down, leaned back, and said the words that burned through me like fire. "You're just waiting to die." It was quiet for a second after that. Even she seemed surprised by her own cruelty, but she didn't take it back. Her friends at the table laughed awkwardly, not knowing what else to do. The sound of their laughter felt louder than thunder. I sat there frozen, unable to speak. The world around me blurred, but her face stayed clear, careless, proud, unbothered. The daughter I'd raised with love had just declared my life worthless, and she didn't even realize it. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply stood up, placed my napkin on the table, and walked out. The room went silent as I left. No one stopped me. I walked into the night air and felt the chill bite through my chest. I didn't take my coat. I didn't even take my cane. I just walked until the streetlights faded, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my heart. When I got home, I sat in my old chair, the one my wife used to say made me look like a king, and stared at the walls. Every photograph, every memory, every sacrifice felt like a mistake. I had spent decades working for someone who saw me as nothing but an inconvenience. I wasn't her father anymore. I was a burden, a background noise in her perfect modern life. That night, I didn't sleep. I thought about everything. The nights I came home bleeding from work, the days I sold my belongings for her dreams, The times I said no to myself so I could say yes to her. And for what? To hear that I was just waiting to die? Those words didn't just hurt. They rewrote everything I thought I knew about love and family. But as the hours passed, anger slowly left me. What replaced it was something else: clarity. I realized that I had spent my whole life giving without boundaries, believing that love meant sacrifice without limits. Maybe I had made her this way by never letting her struggle, by protecting her from every hardship I once endured. I had raised her to think she was owed everything, and in doing so, I'd erased my own value in her eyes. When the first light of morning crept through the window, I knew what I had to do. I wasn't going to argue or seek revenge. I was going to act. Calmly, silently, completely. She wanted me gone from her life, and I was finally ready to give her exactly what she asked for. But this time, on my own terms. When morning came, I didn't feel angry anymore. The pain had settled into something cold, steady, and clear. I made tea, sat by the window, and watched the sun rise over the same street I'd walked for 40 years. Everything looked the same, but inside, something had changed forever. I realized that I had spent my whole life reacting to her moods, trying to fix, to please, to earn the love that should have been freely given. Not anymore. This time, I wouldn't raise my voice or beg for respect. I would simply act, quietly, legally, completely. I started by opening the small drawer in my study. Inside were the files I'd kept for years: property deeds, savings certificates, trust details, and my lawyer's card. Every number, every signature was still under my name. I was never careless, even when I trusted her completely. Maybe part of me always knew that love without gratitude could one day turn dangerous. Now, that caution was my shield. I dialed my lawyer's number. He was an old friend, someone who had helped me through my wife's passing. When he answered, his voice was calm, professional. I told him I wanted to review my finances and update my documents. He didn't ask questions. Perhaps he could hear the tiredness in my voice. We scheduled a meeting for the afternoon. I hung up the phone, took a long breath, and looked around the room one last time. The house felt less like home now. It felt like a cage built from my own devotion. Before leaving, I walked through every corner: the kitchen where I used to cook for her, the living room where we used to watch old films, the garden where she played as a child. Every memory looked different now. They weren't moments of joy anymore. They were proof of how much I had given and how little it had meant. I wasn't angry at her. I was disappointed in myself. I had mistaken sacrifice for strength, silence for patience, and unconditional love for respect. When I arrived at the lawyer's office, I laid out every document carefully. We went through each one: account statements, ownership papers, beneficiary details. I listened, nodded, and signed where needed. The lawyer looked at me over his glasses and said, "You seem sure." I was. I wasn't planning revenge. I was planning freedom. I wanted to protect what was left of my life, not from thieves, but from ungrateful hearts. By evening, all the arrangements were made. The new documents were signed, notarized, and sealed. My daughter's access was suspended. Every account, every joint asset, every legal tie that allowed her to control me financially was now under my authority alone. It wasn't done out of spite. It was done out of self-respect. I didn't owe her anything anymore. She had already taken what mattered most: my faith in family. When I got home, I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark and listened to the quiet hum of the night. For the first time in years, it didn't feel lonely. It felt clean, like the silence before a storm finally passes. I knew she would notice soon. The world would remind her that her words had consequences. But when that moment came, I wouldn't be there to argue. I had already said everything I needed to, not with my voice, but with my signature. That night, I slept deeply. No dreams, no anger, no regrets. Just peace. The kind that comes when you stop trying to be understood by people who refuse to see you. The decision was made, and it was final. The next morning, I would close the last door quietly and walk into the life I should have chosen years ago, one that belonged only to me. The next morning, I dressed carefully, clean shirt, old blazer, polished shoes. I wanted to look sharp, not broken. The world may have aged me, but it hadn't taken my discipline. I walked to the lawyer's office with the steadiness of a man who had made peace with his decision. I wasn't rushing, and I wasn't afraid. I knew what had to be done, and I was going to do it with precision, not emotion. When I arrived, the lawyer already had the files ready. We began with my main bank accounts, the ones my daughter had partial access to for convenience. It was a practical decision once, made out of trust. Now it looked like a mistake. But I was fortunate. Most of my core holdings, long-term deposits, trust funds, and property deeds, still required my signature alone. My lawyer explained every option carefully, and I signed each document without hesitation. We closed her access first. Every card, every digital permission, every linked account, terminated. The law was clear. A parent had the right to protect personal finances in case of emotional manipulation or neglect. She had mocked me for being old-fashioned, but it was that same old-fashioned caution that now safeguarded me completely. Each signature I placed down was another wall between me and her entitlement. Then we moved on to the trust. Years earlier, my late wife and I had created it to secure our family's future. It was meant to benefit both children equally, ensuring they were never left struggling. But my wife had wisely included a clause, one that allowed adjustments if a beneficiary displayed harmful or exploitative behavior toward the trustee. My lawyer showed me the clause again, his finger tracing the words my wife once insisted on keeping. I could almost hear her voice. If they forget their love, remind them with consequence. I signed the amendment. My daughter's name was officially removed from the active beneficiary list. Her share would now be held in suspension, inaccessible, unclaimable, until further notice. The control transferred fully to me. My son, who had never asked for a penny, remained untouched. Next came the investments. Over the years, I had built a quiet fortune. Small business shares, rental income, savings certificates, all meticulously recorded. We moved every asset into a private trust account under my name, safeguarded by two signatures, mine and the lawyer's. This ensured that no one, not even family, could access it without my written consent. The process was tedious, but I felt lighter with each step. This wasn't about revenge. It was about order, reclaiming what was rightfully mine, both legally and emotionally. The final step was simple but powerful, a formal restriction notice. It prevented any future claim or inheritance transfer without direct consent from me or my estate executor. In other words, my daughter could no longer use me as a living ATM. The law, once just words on paper, now stood as my shield. By afternoon, it was done. The lawyer handed me a folder of updated documents, neatly sealed with my initials. "Everything's protected," he said. I nodded, thanked him, and walked out into the quiet street. The weight that had sat on my shoulders for years, the guilt, the dependence, the fear of being a burden, began to lift. I realized something that day. Age doesn't make you powerless. Forgetting your worth does. When I returned home, I made tea and sat in my chair. The house was silent, but it felt different, peaceful instead of lonely. I looked around, knowing this might be my last evening in that place. I didn't need the walls that held too many memories of disappointment. I needed space to breathe again, somewhere new, somewhere clean. The paperwork was done, the lines were drawn, and for the first time in years, I was the one in control. I hadn't raised my voice, I hadn't sought revenge, and I hadn't broken a single law. I had simply used wisdom, the same tool I once used to build her future, but now it was rebuilding mine. By the time the sun rose the next morning, my decision had already been made. There was no hesitation left, no doubt in my mind. I had done everything by the book, the signatures, the documents, the transfers. But there was one last step to make it final. I called my lawyer again. This time, not to discuss possibilities, but to execute them. His voice carried the same quiet respect as before. "Are you sure?" he asked. I said yes, not out of anger, but out of certainty. It was time to draw the line between love and self-respect. Within an hour, the process began. Every account I owned, from the savings I'd built over decades to the investment returns I'd quietly managed, was consolidated into one secured trust account. Then, as instructed, the funds were redirected into new holdings that excluded her entirely. It wasn't hidden. It was all transparent, legal, traceable. But it was untouchable to anyone but me. The total balance was just under $4.6 million, a number that had once represented years of exhaustion, sacrifice, and dreams for my family. Now, it represented freedom. Not revenge, not greed, just freedom. Every transaction was signed with a steady hand. I felt no guilt as the system confirmed the changes. She had treated me like a debt to erase. Now, the account was cleared, and I was the one who walked away whole. Once the transfer was complete, I wrote one last letter. Not long, not angry, just final. I wrote, "You told me I was waiting to die. You forgot I was still living. I gave you everything, and you gave me silence. So I'm taking back what's mine, my peace, my dignity, and my name." I folded the letter carefully, placed it inside an envelope, and left it on the kitchen table beside her framed childhood photo, the one she'd once begged me never to lose. After that, I called the bank one last time and confirmed the cancellation of all joint access. Credit cards, linked accounts, even the small monthly allowance I had been sending her without fail, gone. The clerk, polite but curious, asked if I wanted to leave a reason on the file. I said, family restructuring. That was all. When the last confirmation email arrived, I printed it, placed it in my briefcase, and sat back in my chair. The house was silent, but for the first time in years, it wasn't empty. It was mine again. The air felt lighter, like I could finally breathe without waiting for another insult, another dismissal, another reminder that I was old and useless. I looked around the room one final time. Everything I'd built, the walls, the furniture, the art, had stories she no longer cared to remember, and that was fine. Those stories belonged to me now. I realized I didn't need a confrontation. I didn't need to prove her wrong with words. The bank notifications and frozen accounts would do that for me. They would be my silence, my voice, and my justice all at once. Later that evening, I called a taxi. The driver asked for a destination. I gave him the address of a seaside town 3 hours away, quiet, unknown, peaceful. I had already spoken to my lawyer about transferring mail to a private P.O. box. There would be no forwarding address, no phone calls, no explanations. The man she thought was waiting to die had already planned his rebirth. As the taxi drove away, I watched the house disappear in the rearview mirror. I didn't cry. I didn't feel triumph either. I just felt done. Finally, completely done. The man who once built everything for others had built something for himself at last. Peace. The transfer was complete, not just in money, but in life. It didn't take long for her to find me. A few days after the transfers, she showed up at my house, storming through the door like a gust of fury and disbelief. Her eyes were wide, her face pale, her voice trembling between anger and desperation. I sat quietly in the living room, already expecting this moment. I had imagined every version of her reaction: rage, denial, manipulation. But what I saw was panic, the kind of panic that only hits when the ground beneath you suddenly disappears. She shouted questions faster than I could count. "Why would you do this? How could you take everything?" Her voice cracked with a mixture of shock and entitlement. I didn't move. I just let her speak, every word confirming that she had learned nothing from the life I gave her. To her, it was about money. To me, it was about meaning. When she ran out of breath, I stood up slowly and walked to my study. I opened the drawer and pulled out the lawyer's letter, the one she'd already received a copy of. This one was for her to read in my presence, so she would finally face what her words had done. I handed it to her without expression. She snatched it from my hand, her anger still flaring. As her eyes moved down the page, her tone shifted. The lines were simple and unembellished. You said I was just waiting to die. I decided to stop waiting and to live again. Every cent I earned was built on sacrifice. Every insult you gave me was a withdrawal from your own future. Now the account is closed. Her hands began to shake. I could see tears forming, but I didn't speak. I wasn't cruel. I was calm. That silence hurt her more than shouting ever could. She tried to explain, saying she didn't mean it, that she was just angry, that people say things they don't mean. But I knew the truth. When people are angry, they reveal who they are beneath the politeness. Her words that night weren't an accident. They were honesty, without a filter. She kept asking if I could undo it. "You can fix this," she said, voice cracking. I shook my head. Everything had been done legally and properly. Even if I wanted to, I couldn't reverse it now, and I didn't want to. For years, I'd been patient. I had given her everything she needed to live a good life. But the one thing I never gave her, and maybe should have, was a consequence. That day, she finally met it. As she spoke, I noticed something strange. Her tone changed from anger to pleading, then to guilt. She wasn't just upset about the money. She was scared of what it meant. Because the moment she realized she no longer controlled me financially, she realized she had lost all her power. She was just a daughter again, not the one calling the shots. The roles had reversed, and it frightened her. When she broke down crying, I didn't feel victory. I felt closure. It wasn't joy or satisfaction, just relief that I no longer had to fight for respect. I waited until her sobs quieted, then said the only words I had left. "You told me to wait to die. I decided to stop waiting for your kindness." She looked at me like she didn't recognize the man in front of her. Maybe she didn't. The father who always forgave her had disappeared. The man who stood before her wasn't cruel, but he was finished. I walked her to the door. She hesitated as if expecting me to stop her, to hug her, to take it all back. But I didn't. She walked out slowly, clutching the letter, her tears staining the paper. When the door closed, I exhaled deeply. The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't lonely anymore. It was peaceful. I'd done what I had to do. I hadn't shouted. I hadn't humiliated her. I'd simply let the truth speak in the language she understood best. Consequences. That evening, I poured myself a glass of water, looked around the empty room, and knew my time here was done. The next step wasn't about punishment. It was about freedom. It was time to disappear. That night, after the confrontation, I packed in silence. I didn't need much. Just my passport, a few clothes, some cash, and the folder of documents proving everything I had done was legal. The rest didn't matter anymore. The house was clean, quiet, and empty of feeling. For years, it had felt like a home I was clinging to. Now it felt like a reminder of everything I'd outgrown. I didn't leave with sadness. I left with certainty. Before I locked the door, I took one last look around. The old clock in the hallway ticked softly, just as it had when my wife was alive. I touched its frame, whispered a quiet thank you, and walked out. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. This wasn't an escape. It was a choice to live the rest of my life on my own terms, not as someone else's obligation. I took the first train out of town, sitting by the window as the city faded behind me. The lights blurred into long, golden streaks against the night. Every station we passed felt like another layer of my past peeling away. No one looked at me twice. I was just another old man with a small bag, heading somewhere quiet. That anonymity was my peace. The following morning, I checked into a small seaside inn 2 towns away. The woman at the reception smiled politely when I signed the register with just my initials. "Long stay?" she asked. "Just long enough," I said. I paid in cash and took a small room facing the water. The air smelled like salt and new beginnings. For the first time in decades, I slept through the night without waking up to thoughts of bills, responsibilities, or disrespect. Over the next few weeks, I settled into a new rhythm. Each morning, I'd walk along the beach, my cane sinking into the sand with every slow step. I'd watch families playing by the shore, children laughing, parents chasing after them. I didn't envy them. I'd lived that part of life already. What I felt instead was gratitude, that I'd been given enough time to reclaim what was left of mine. I used part of the $4.6 million to buy a modest cottage overlooking the ocean. Nothing fancy. White walls, wooden floors, a garden with room for vegetables and flowers. It wasn't luxury I wanted, it was freedom. I hired no help, made my own meals, and spent my evenings writing letters to no one in particular. Some I addressed to my late wife, others to the version of myself I'd once been. The man who thought love meant giving endlessly. I donated quietly too, set up monthly contributions to a few elder care foundations and scholarships for students who'd lost parents. I didn't want recognition. I wanted to make sure that somewhere out there, someone's child would learn what gratitude meant. The irony wasn't lost on me. My daughter had mocked me for being outdated, yet here I was, using what she called old money to build something that still mattered. Back in the city, she must have been unraveling. The lawyer later told me she'd called the office multiple times, demanding my location, threatening lawsuits, crying into the phone. But the truth was simple. She had no claim anymore. The accounts were locked, the transfers complete, and the law fully on my side. She couldn't undo what she had done. Every cruel word, every laugh at my expense had signed her own separation papers. Months later, I heard through the lawyer that she had tried to trace me. Reporters even called it the disappearing father case. But no one ever found me. I had become a name without a face, a lesson whispered between people who'd forgotten what respect for elders meant. That was enough for me. I didn't need headlines. I needed silence. Every evening now, I sit on the porch of my cottage watching the sun melt into the horizon. The waves come and go, constant and patient, just like time. I'm no longer waiting for calls, visits, or apologies. I don't need them. I found peace in vanishing, not as revenge, but as release. The days that followed my disappearance felt like stepping into a new world, one without noise, guilt, or expectations. My life had become wonderfully small, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I woke up each morning to the sound of waves breaking against the shore, not alarms or angry voices. The air smelled like salt and morning dew, and every sunrise reminded me that peace doesn't always come from forgiveness. Sometimes it comes from distance. I began to live slowly, deliberately. My mornings were quiet rituals. I would brew black coffee on the small stove, sit by the window, and read the same newspaper twice, not for the headlines, but for the comfort of routine. I'd take a walk along the beach road, greeting fishermen and shopkeepers who never asked questions about where I came from. They just smiled and nodded. Here, I wasn't Dad, or the man who paid for everything. I was just another old man with a story no one asked to hear, and that anonymity was a blessing. I bought a few essentials, a sturdy radio, some books, and seeds for a small garden behind the cottage. I'd always wanted to plant something of my own, not for others, not for show, but just to watch life grow quietly under my care. Soon, tomatoes, herbs, and jasmine began to bloom. Every day I watered them, feeling a strange satisfaction in seeing something thrive simply because I was there for it. Unlike people, the plants never forgot who kept them alive. The money, all $4.6 million of it, no longer meant what it once did. I didn't touch most of it. Instead, I redirected a portion into silent donations. I funded medical bills for elderly people in nearby villages, paid for a few children's school fees anonymously, helped maintain the local nursing home that struggled to stay open. No one knew who the benefactor was, but I didn't need credit. The joy came from knowing I was doing something good again, but this time without being used. Occasionally, I would visit the town square. People there knew me as Mr. Daniel, the quiet man who always carried fresh bread and fed stray dogs. They didn't know I had once lived in a mansion or that my daughter had called me useless. They only knew me as a kind man who smiled easily. That was all I wanted to be remembered for. At night, I would sit on the porch, writing letters I never planned to send. Some were to my late wife, telling her how much I missed her calm wisdom. Others were to my daughter, not out of anger, but out of reflection. I wrote about the day she was born, her first steps, the school mornings I used to wake early for, the lullabies her mother and I sang together. I didn't blame her in those letters. I just wished she had seen the man behind the sacrifices, not the age, not the wrinkles, not the silence. But I never mailed them. Some truths are better left between a father and the sea. Life had become simple. My clothes dried under the sun. My meals were small, but satisfying. I learned to live without noise, to eat without company, to exist without expectation. And yet, for the first time in decades, I wasn't lonely. I realized loneliness isn't being alone. It's being unseen. Here, I was seen for who I was, not for what I had to give. Sometimes I'd catch news on the radio about a city scandal or a missing man. My name came up once in a report. They called me the father who vanished. I turned the radio off and smiled. I hadn't vanished. I had simply appeared in the one place I was meant to be, my own life. In that quiet seaside town, I found what wealth, family, and legacy had never given me. Peace. No more trying to prove worth. No more waiting for calls that never came. Just mornings filled with sunlight, evenings filled with calm, and nights filled with dreams that didn't hurt anymore. Now, as the years have settled quietly around me, I find myself thinking less about what was lost and more about what was found. I sit on my porch most evenings, the sea whispering just beyond the garden, and I finally understand that peace is not something others give you. It's something you claim when you stop waiting for apologies. My life is smaller now, quieter, but it finally feels like mine. There are no raised voices, no debts of love to repay, no one measuring my worth in bank balances or usefulness. Just me, the waves, and time. I often think back to that day, the last time I saw my daughter standing in my doorway, crying because the control she once had was gone. I remember the look on her face when she realized that I wasn't angry, just finished. That look told me more than any apology could. It showed me that she finally saw me as a person, not a provider. Maybe that was the only lesson left for her to learn. I don't hate her. I never did. But I've accepted that love without respect is nothing more than obligation wearing a kind mask. Sometimes I catch myself wondering if she ever truly understood what those words, "You're just waiting to die," did to me. Maybe one day she will, when she's older, when time has quieted her pride. Or maybe she won't, and that's fine too. Not all stories end with understanding. Some end with distance, and that's enough. Because distance, for me, became the space where dignity could breathe again. I've learned something in my solitude. Age doesn't take your strength. It reveals who around you ever deserved it. When I had money, everyone needed me. When I lost patience, they disappeared. That's how I learned the truth. The loudest love is often the most hollow. The real kind doesn't demand, doesn't insult, and doesn't leave when the giving stops. I had to lose almost everything to see that clearly. Now, the money I once used to buy security has built something better: purpose. Through the charities I fund quietly, I see letters arrive from people I'll never meet, thanking a man whose name they don't know. They call him the silent helper. I smile at that. Because that's who I wanted to be. Not a father chasing validation, but a man who still finds ways to give without being stepped on. That's the kind of giving my daughter never understood. The kind that doesn't ask for anything back. Sometimes, in the evenings, I write one last kind of letter. Not to her, but to myself. A record of everything I learned. I write lines like, "Forgiveness is not for them, it's for you." Or, "Peace begins where expectation ends." It helps me stay honest, grounded, and free. My handwriting trembles now, but the words come easy. They aren't filled with regret, just truth. People think revenge is about hurting someone else. It isn't. Real revenge is living in a way that proves they no longer have power over you. That's what I did. I didn't shout. I didn't ruin her life. I simply removed myself from the version of it she built, the version where I was small, replaceable, and waiting to die. The truth is, I never waited to die. I waited to live. It just took me too long to start. Now, when the sun sets over the sea and the last light fades across the water, I close my eyes and breathe. I think of all the years spent giving, all the insults swallowed, all the silence endured, and I feel no bitterness, only calm, because I learned that respect, once lost, can't be bought back with words or tears. It must be earned through actions. And in the end, I acted not out of hate, but out of clarity. Final thought. She told me I was waiting to die. But the truth is, I was waiting to be free. And when I finally stopped waiting, that's when I started living.